As a way of introduction, my name is Rich Forwaller. I'm a principal product manager with Amazon Detective. For a little bit of context on my role, one of the things I love about being a product manager is I get to have great conversations with you, our customers, understand the security services you're using, some of the challenges you're facing, and take that feedback back to our development team and really kind of iterate on better solutions. So I'm excited today that I have two people co-presenting with me that kind of represent that conversation. So with me today is Rima Tanish. Rima is on our security engineering team. She and her team are really responsible for some of the machine learning modules we have, the feature that we're going to demo today. So Rima, thank you for coming. And then with us is Jordan Kramer. Jordan comes to us from the Asurion. He is the director of the Cyber Command Center. A customer of Detective. Jordan's been gracious enough to share his experience of using Detective and how they use it to solve security investigation use cases. So really excited to have both of them here. We're looking forward to a great conversation. We've kind of dissected the agenda that way. So I'm going to provide a quick overview of Amazon Detective. If you're new to the service, some of the use cases we support. Rima will then come in and give us a demo on the latest feature that we announced yesterday in the keynote, which is an extension of our finding groups. And then Jordan will come and kind of wrap us up on how Asurion's using Detective and hopefully share some of the common challenges they went through that will resonate with you and then how Detective is helping in those. So let's go ahead and get started. So before I do start, actually, I have hopefully a fun question. Do we have any Spider-Man fans in the audience today? All right, I'm expecting really great survey responses from you. So I have to admit, I'm quite the fan of Spider-Man. Ever since the early morning Saturday cartoons to the latest slew of movies. If you're not a fan, though, you've probably heard of a very kind of popular phrase within the movies. There's actually a Wikipedia entry about it called the Peter Parker principle. And basically it just says, with great power comes great responsibility. The essence is that if you've been empowered to do something, you should use that power for the betterment of mankind. Now, it turns out like a lot of things in Hollywood, this didn't actually start with Spider-Man. You can go back as early as the 1900s. Winston Churchill gave a speech to the House of Commons and basically said a very similar thing, which is, with power comes responsibility. But it's interesting, towards the end, he says something that really intrigues me. It's with no power, there is no responsibility. And I've been really interested about that whole balance. As I've talked with customers to understand how the cloud is changing what security practitioners do and how they respond to things, I've been super intrigued about this balance between power and responsibility. The movement to cloud has definitely done good things, such as injecting security earlier in the development lifecycle or sharing that responsibility between platform providers as well as other teams. But it's also been super interesting to see that because the cloud allows development teams to move so fast and so independent, that I've counted several scenarios in my customer conversations where that movement has left the security team kind of on the sidewalk, in the sense that they're still being held responsible for security in the cloud, but they haven't been empowered. So I'm going to put my notch on the Peter Parker principle, and I'm going to say that responsibility should also equal empowerment. And I want to talk about some examples that I've seen of disempowered security teams. And I want to talk about how Detective helps with those use cases. And the intent really is to kind of share some customer conversations on how these kind of disempowered balances come, because it's very interesting to think about what affects the empowerment of a team. And then again, how Detective is trying to help our customers solve these problems. So the three that I have here are lack of visibility, not enough people, and then also kind of prioritizing findings, or we could even maybe say kind of the alert fatigue scenario. So let me talk about lack of visibility. The old adage of you can't protect what you can't see is very true in AWS as well. Typically, when we look at, what are the data sources that are going to provide security teams the most relevant visibility, we typically talk about AWS CloudTrail, which is our service that collects all the API calls. And then the other one is Amazon VPC Flows, which collects all the network traffic. There are other services that provide logging capability, and unfortunately, we don't have time to kind of dig into those. But if you are curious, kind of meet me after the session. We'll talk about those. But we really kind of focus on how do we make that visibility more powerful for our customers. And I'll give you a good example. The other day, I actually spoke with a customer who hadn't enabled VPC flow logs. And the reason why is they've done kind of this cost-benefit evaluation. And they said, the amount of teams that we have, the applications that we're pushing, those logs are just too big. Not only would it take kind of a financial impact for us to turn those on and to centralize them, I haven't invested my team to really kind of extract useful information for those. And it was interesting as I kind of pushed on that, the feedback was there probably is very relevant security information, especially around if an incident happened. But for me to parse that and extract that would be a very hard and arduous process. And that's what really kind of made me think more than anything about what are the resources that it would take to extract relevant information from VPC flow logs. And that kind of gets to my second point, which is just there's just not enough people. I'm sure you're all familiar with, I read almost on a weekly basis of some news blog that talks about the available cybersecurity positions that are out there and who's filling those. The latest that I saw, I actually thought it was pretty interesting. It was from the National Institute of Science Technology, or NIST, and this just actually came out this week, where they looked at the positions that were available in the market and what the cybersecurity skills you would need to have to fulfill those, and kind of bench those against the applicable pool that was there, and came up with this ratio of about like 69 workers to every 100 job openings. Now that's impressive, and so if you're in the cybersecurity industry, keep up the good work. You have ample opportunity, but what I think is more tangible as I talk with customers, it's really kind of that ratio of security personnel. Again, I spoke with a customer a couple weeks ago. They had a SOC team of about 10 engineers, and the question I asked is, well, how many developers do you have? And that ratio was about a 10-to-1 ratio. They had about 6 teams of developers that spanned between 10 to 15. And they would say for every kind of one security engineer, we need to scale that person probably anywhere from like 5 to 6x. So that's interesting because if you think about it, we all at AWS, we always talk about scale and the need to automate things, but the pressure or the demand on the security team to scale is probably higher than any other team out there. Because they're not tied sometimes to kind of a revenue impacting business, they're kind of pushed to the extreme in the sense of what they need to accomplish. And then you relate that to some customers who maybe are born in the cloud or very small and don't even have a dedicated security person to kind of run that investigation, or that responsibility is shared without the team. You just walk away from those conversations with this overwhelming impression of the demand to just get the most out of the resources you have and with your security practitioners. And then this kind of leads to the last one is, if they are such a finite resource, what are we doing to make sure that they are evaluating the right things? Jordan will actually talk about this. He's got a really great line in there, but at the end of the day, if you look at the volume that they have, inevitably there will be some things that you will not have the resources or the time to investigate. So the trick there is, how do we make sure that those are okay to be ignored, and how do we make sure we're prioritizing the right things? Again, spoke with another customer just a couple weeks ago. They had actually sat down and done the math. They had a SOC team of about 5 to 6 security engineers. They looked at the volume of guard duty findings that they were getting on a weekly basis and kind of looked at the mean time to resolve those, and kind of came up with an estimate that for us to look, to run each finding down to the ground and to what it should be, would take us 365 days for just 1 week's worth of alert volume. And I don't think that's abnormal. I think that's actually accurate. So it's just interesting to kind of have these conversations and understand these pressures that are outside the security team's control, and how they introduce lack of visibility, how they introduce a constraint on resources, and how they introduce a scenario where you're just inundated with uneventful alerts and not prioritizing things that are of the highest security value. So what are we doing about this? So I'm going to dive deep onto 2 of these topics. I'm going to dive deep on how Detective helps with automating data collection, and I would also say this is more like automating security value collection. And then I'm going to talk about the steps that we take to help reduce triage time. I'm going to leave it to Rima to really walk through the consolidating findings, because that really speaks to the feature that we announced yesterday in the keynote. So automated data collection. So if you're not familiar with Detective, this is a service that sits on top of a couple of data sources. So the ones that we kind of call core data sources are AWS CloudTrail logs, Amazon VPC Flow logs, and then also guard duty findings. We do have an optional data source you can see there, EKS audit logs. I won't dive into that too much, but again, if you have some questions, feel free to come up after. So how we've automated this is once you've enabled guard duty, and if you're not familiar with guard duty is our threat detection service that will continually monitor your accounts and workloads. And it will send what we call a finding when it spots any kind of suspicious or potentially malicious activity. So once you enable those sources, we will automatically start to ingest that information. So what does that mean? It's not in the sense that you've gone in and enabled those log sources and then pointed us to an S3 bucket or even configured anything. By just enabling Detective, we will automatically go in and detect what services you are using and start to ingest this data. Where it gets valuable is the visibility that we provide. So if we go back to the example that I have of a customer that didn't want to turn on VPC flow logs because of the volume and the complexity, you don't have to turn on that data source. We're actually in the back end ingesting that data, and then we're extracting useful information for you to see that. So some of our customers use Detective to get visibility into their network flows, even though they haven't enabled those log sources because of other things kind of outside their control. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, we extended this to 8 new security services. So we call this AWS Security Findings. So just like guard duty sends a threat detection finding, each of these different services will send a different finding for the use cases they support. So for example, with Inspector, which is our vulnerability detection, it will send a finding when it spots a software vulnerability. Macy is another security service that it will send a finding when it spots sensitive data that may be discovered inadvertently in an S3 bucket. So again, the nice thing about this, if you're using any of these security services and Security Hub, those sendings automatically, without any intervention, get sent to Security Hub. And so we use that integration to ingest those findings. So again, what's nice is you don't have to configure anything, you just have to enable a service, and under the hood, we will detect what security services you're using, and we will start to pull in those findings and the log information and start to build what we call a behavior graph, and I'm gonna talk about that here a little bit later. And again, I wanna talk about what we're doing. It's not that we're just collecting the log information and putting it in the console for you to search and parse. Again, a lot of the challenges we heard from customers is I don't have a process to extract value from those logs. I need somebody to kind of do that undifferentiated heavy lifting for me. So we're looking at what we call security relevant information. So this could be like login attempts that have failed, IP addresses or API calls from regions that aren't normal. Detective will store up to kind of a year's worth of data. And we do that for several reasons, but one of them is that it allows us to establish a baseline of what is kind of normal in your environment and helps us kind of identify what's the new activity that you might be suspicious. The other thing that we'll do after we start extracting this information, I call this our superpowers. And it's really around our graph database, our machine learning, and our optimized queries. If you're not familiar with a graph database, these are really powerful databases in the world of security. So instead of collecting data in the forms of like a column or a table where you have to infer a relationship like through a foreign key, graph databases store data in more of kind of a relationship-centered scenario where you have what's called a node and an edge. And those nodes really kind of represent what we call an entity. So kind of think of maybe like, a person, place, or thing. And that edge represents a relationship and how that relationship can influence the nodes over time. The best way that I have found to describe this is kind of using a social media example. So for example, if my co-presenter, Rima, goes into a social media website and creates a profile, in a graph database world, we would understand that as a node. And then as she's on that website, she's browsing other profiles, she sees topics of interest and sees somebody else that she recognizes. In this example, it's gonna be Mr. Jeff Barr. Jeff Barr, again, would be kind of represented as a node, and that connection or that follow request, whatever that may be in that platform, that would be that relationship. So what's interesting now to think about is if Rima is interested in something, or if Rima is attending an event like Inforce, a reInvent, and she's posting that on social media, the chances that Jeff is interested in that or impacted in that are probably very highly, we have a high confidence that that will happen. Now you compare that to somebody like me who comes in, I create a profile, I send out a connection request, and I get denied, which is actually very common in my real life, to be honest. That relationship is very different. If something were to happen to me, an event or security incident, the likelihood that that would affect Jeff is probably low because we do not have that established connection. But if something were to affect Rima, or if something were to affect Jeff, because of that correlation, there's probably a high confidence that those do coexist. The real advantage here is that this connection first approach to data, it really means that your edges are persisted over time. They're not temporarily calculated by using out-of-band processing or a foreign key or anything like that. You know, unlike a traditional database system, the approach means that you have these relationships that are already established and persisted over time, so you can ask some really tough questions but get those responses in a very timely manner, like, did this event that affected Rima also affect Jeff, and so on. So how does this work in Detective? So Detective, for us, nodes, we call them entities. They would be like an EC2 instance, there would be an S3 bucket, there would be an IAM role or a user. And as we start to extract that information, we can start to see the behavior and the relationships that they have. So for example, if we were to spot a guard duty finding and we saw that that was detected on an EC2 instance, because we're graphing that as we ingest the data, we can very quickly understand that that EC2 instance was also attached to an IAM role, and that IAM role was also used by an IAM user, and that EC2 instance also had a connection to an IP address, which was connected to an EKS pod. So if you look at this from kind of a blast radius scenario around that finding, you get a very fast view of here's all the entities or the nodes that were connected to that security event. Now, what we also do on top of this is our machine learning, and I wish we could dive deeper into this. It's worth a whole session. But that machine learning allows us to weigh the edges. It allows us to see, like in my example, that although I have a connection with Rima, it's probably not as statistically relevant as the connection between her and Jeff. So what that allows us to do is we can start to pull away things that, although they are connected, they're not relevant to the security investigation that you're conducting. But we can also start to pull in things that we've never seen before, like a user agent or an IP address or a region that's never been used based on your normal behavior. And the latest that we've done is we're now kind of pulling in an additional finding source, which is our inspector findings. And this is the feature that we announced yesterday in the keynote. Now, I don't want to steal Rima's thunder here, so I want to go quickly through this. But if you're not familiar with finding groups is a feature that we released a little bit before reInvent last year. It allows you to look at security events as a single event rather than disparate findings. So instead of like chasing down singular guard duty findings and chasing down singular inspector findings, you can say, are these connected? Is the guard duty finding that I have a cause because of an inspector vulnerability or a reachability? And that's the demo that we're going to do today. So let me go ahead and pass it to you, Rima. There you go. Good luck.
Thank you, Rich. So customers ask me how to quickly prioritize and group security findings during an investigation and also identify root cause. So when a threat actor tries or attempts or they successfully access your environment, they typically perform a sequence of events that could lead to many security findings. And these events would typically happen across time and many resources. So if you try to investigate a security finding in isolation, it could lead to misinterpretation and also difficulty in identifying root cause. So to solve for this problem, Detective uses graph analytics and statistical models to infer relationships between findings and entities. Then we perform this clustering and we surface it as a single event. which we think you should investigate together. So next, I want to talk about a demo. I'll be showing you a demo to demonstrate how you can use detective to investigate a scenario that generates many different security findings from different sources. And of course, this is possible with the newly launched feature that Rich was mentioning, the detective integration with Security Hub. We're also now including the inspector-based finding in finding groups. We perform the clustering and identification of the major event that connects these components. We're also going to use visualization to quickly identify root cause and call for action. So before I get started with the demo, I want to talk about the setup. So for this setup, I actually ran this experiment around the 7th. So the timestamp is the 7th of the month. So for the target setup, I have a VPC configuration with a private subnet and a public subnet. I run 2 EC2 instances. One is internal, the other one is external. And each of the instances is running exactly the same application, internal application server and an external application server. Now, I do want to mention that the application servers are running an outdated version of Log4j, which has a known vulnerability that inspector is able to detect, and it will generate a CVE-based finding. I also have a bucket that is configured private that contains sensitive data, and it's within the VPC. However, I do run some security-based services, including Guard Duty, Detective, of course, Inspector, Macy, and Security Hub. So we have our target setup. Next, I want to talk about the unauthorized actor setup and their movement. So because the external application is web-facing, and as we know, it's running an unpatched server, the actor is scanning and looking for this specific vulnerability. They are able to discover the server. So they run a script, and then they are able to access the EC2 instance. So they discover that this EC2 instance has an instance profile with a role permission that's least privileged. So it's not really allowing them to perform their lateral movement. They're really interested in that bucket. So they assume there is maybe another server that's running the same unpatched server. So they uncover my other internal instance running the application. And in this time, this EC2 instance has a highly privileged role. They're able to assume this role and perform a discovery. They discover this bucket that has a really interesting name, and they're able to get the objects. So this is the setup. And just to summarize, looking at the entire scenario, from a tactic perspective, we have an initial access that maps to our accessing the unpatched server, followed by discovery or reconnaissance through the server port scan. Then we have a credential access phase using the EC2 credentials, followed by another discovery, reconnaissance, to list the S3 bucket, and finally collecting the objects from that S3 bucket. Now, the effect of this scenario is a list of security findings generated from various providers that don't necessarily talk to each other. And what you see here is just a view from what these security findings would look like in Security Hub. So we have some inspector CVE-based findings, reporting on the software, vulnerability, guard duty findings, and more. So next, let's get started with the demo. So when you log into the AWS console, you can search for detective. And if you do have configure detective, you will land at the summary page. So within the summary page, there are various sections, but I'm going to focus on the finding groups. Notice that in this view, I do not show any finding groups. It's only because I need to change my scope time. Again, I ran this scenario on the 7th. So I'm just going to change, only because I know, I'm going to change it to the 7th and update my dates. Assuming that I had executed this scenario within the last 24 hours, this will be surfaced and you will be able to see it without having to change the date. But I wanted to just show you that capability. Another way to access finding groups is to just simply go to the right panel and click on finding groups. This will list all of the finding groups in your environment. So looking at the finding group that generated as an effect from executing my scenario, there are some useful fields that will give you some context as to what is in this finding group. The severity is high, and the way we compute the severity is based on the highest severity of any given guard duty finding within that group. The title, we construct that dynamically. So we perform a mapping, we extract the finding types within the cluster, and we put it together, and that gives you a nice context as to what could be possibly contained in the group. There's also observed tactics, the involved AWS accounts, the entities, if you want to get just an overview of what the entity types could be. You can see here that I already have my EC2 instances. I have an S3 bucket. You can also view the stats on your findings. So there's just a breakdown of the findings by severity. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on the title, and that will take me to the finding group details. In the top section, we provide some metadata, such as ID, severity, about this finding group. For this talk, I'm going to focus on the visualization. I'm going to close the side panel just to give us more space. Okay. So the default layout for the visualization is what we call a force directed. A force directed applies a graph modularity, which is a measure of connections in the community. And this is a really nice way to look for patterns, look for clustering. So events that have so many edges will dense together. And just because you already know about the scenario phases, you can quickly see that there are two core clusters, one in the top and one in the bottom, which aligns with the phases of the scenario. We had the first phase that involved the external-facing application, then the internal-facing application and that bucket. If you do not like this view, you can choose some other layouts. We have the circle view. Sometimes it's useful depending on the entities that form in that cluster. The grid view is another option. It breaks the entities or the nodes into two parts, the findings on one side and the other entities on the other side. If you click on any, it'll also highlight the connections. Every time you click on an entity on the right side, you will see some description of that node. So for example, this is an effect, data exfiltration, high severity finding from guard duty. At the bottom, if you are not sure what each of the nodes represent, there is a legend that will reference the color and the various shapes corresponding to findings and resources from a compute, networking, storage types. I'm going to go back to the force directed. Okay, so stepping back, if I'm looking at this graph, I really don't know where to start. You know, it's a graph, it doesn't have a timeline, it's a natural thing for a graph representation, nodes and relationships. All right, so I will scroll down to the involved findings, which list all of the findings within that cluster. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to order them by first seen. In this event, the first seen findings are the CVE-based findings. So these are all inspector-generated reporting on the log, on the liblog, lib4j vulnerability reported on the EC2 instances. Notice that we have the two instances. And then with that, I'm going to go back to my graph. And I will choose the EC2 instance that has that first reported inspector-based vulnerability. So that's our EC2 instance. Notice this is our external-facing EC2 instance. It has the top and the second CVE-based inspector finding. There's a third finding that's reported on this EC2 instance. It is informational, and it's reporting that this EC2 instance is reachable. It's accessible, right? So, but that's okay, because my EC2 instance was intended to be public. So I'm just going to shift those, group them, and put them on the side, and look at my next finding. The pink nodes are networking-based entities, so I'm also grouping those, and I'm going to park them on the side. This is just a nice way for you to organize your investigation, kind of create your own custom view. Now, if we click on this finding, this is our port scan finding that links to an IP address and another high-severity guard duty finding. Notice that this finding is highly connected. And this particular finding is linked to the internal EC2 instance that also has reported CVE-based finding from inspector. This other guard duty finding is quite interesting because it is triggered when the actor accessed the role and performed a discovery. And when you inspect that guard duty finding, you will see that reported in the actions. The middle IP is the actor IP that they use the role that we see highlighted there in green to access the S3 data. I'm going to drag the S3 bucket just to have a nice visualization. And I'm also going to organize this by grabbing the second EC2 and those CVE-based finding, and also push them to further right. And now I want to look at this visualization and just point out that doing this analysis and walkthrough using the finding groups and the visualization capability allows me to quickly identify the various phases of activities that were executed by an actor and quickly identify the root cause. For this specific scenario, the root cause was the unpatched EC2 instances that allowed an external actor, an unauthorized person, to gain access, perform lateral movements, assume roles that are intended to be internal, and then extract data from private bucket back to the actor. So, a call for action. I would start by patching my EC2 instances. Another call for action would be perform an audit for my IAM role. Why do I have a highly privileged IAM role? Inspect the policies, apply some zero trust-based principles and tailor it down. And then finally, ensure that your S3 bucket has proper security controls and sufficient controls to protect your sensitive data. So with that, back to you, Rich.
Thank you, Rima. I'm so grateful we had a backup demo. Never underestimate the potential to run into hiccups. So really excited about this new feature. As I mentioned, some of the key questions we got from our customers was helping them understand if a guard duty was a result of some of the vulnerabilities that were detected by Inspector, as well as some of the network reachability findings. But looked for us to kind of extend that. Inspector is just one of the AWS security services that we offer. We do have the data integration with the others, and so you'll see us iterate quite frequently on this, on incorporating some more security findings. Just real quick, I want to give Jordan as much time as possible. This is kind of the main use case that we shared today because of the launch announcement yesterday. If you have more questions about some of the other features, such as the optimized searches that we can do, some of the pre-built summaries that we have. Also, we have integrations in services like Guard Duty and Security Hub, where you actually can, what we say, pivot from a finding that's available to those. So there's a lot more. At the end of the session, I'm going to share a couple of other sessions if you'd like to attend that are workshop-based, if you want to get a little bit more hands-on with that. But with that, I really want to turn the time over to Jordan so he can talk about their journey in AWS and how they're using Detective today.
Appreciate it, Rich. Thank you. So a few things. So I work for a company called Asurion. We're based out of Nashville, Tennessee. You probably never heard of us, and that's totally fine. I don't believe in coincidences, right? I'm a SOC guy, blue team guy. I didn't mention this to Rich, but it's why I'm wearing a blue shirt, just to kind of represent the trade. As I kind of go into this, it'll become apparent that we all have something in common, right? When I go to conferences and whatnot, I always look at, other presenters and I'm like, man, that looks really cool. I wish we were doing that. So I guess I'm going to encourage everyone, think about the similarities more so than the differences, whether it be our journey, what we're doing, maybe what we're not doing. Everyone has room for growth. Some of the pain points that Rich kind of led with that I'm going to maybe go into a little more detail, they're not unique to us, right? Everyone in this industry is facing similar challenges. One last thing, it just got me thinking. On my plane out here from Nashville, I was watching Anchorman because it's like the best movie ever. And Steve Carell, Brick, right? That scene when he's in the office and he's like, "I love lamp," and Will Ferrell's just like, "Brick, are you just naming things in the office that you love?" And he was like, "Yeah," and I was like, man, I love logs, right? I really do. I have a passion for them. As Rima mentioned, you can't defend what you don't know, right? Or what you don't have any visibility into. And for me, for my money, that's the most critical thing, right? Visibility and having the data you need when you need it. There's nothing worse, right, than being in the midst of an event or an incident and you don't have the telemetry. So a little bit about us. Again, if you've heard of us, super surprised. If not, that's totally cool. Our global headquarters is in Nashville, where I'm from. And we've been around about 25 years. This is our main splash page from our site. You would most likely know us if you've got like Verizon or AT&T here in the US, or our second largest business demographic is in Japan. So if you're a Docomo customer or KDDI, we provide warranty, insurance, break fix, repair, all that, full front to back, and then logistics. If you've seen the U-Break iFix stores anywhere, we own that, and 1,000 other things that make life really, really hard. So I'm going to go through some build slides just to kind of highlight our journey. Again, similarities, not differences. I think for a lot of different reasons, a lot of companies have kind of gone through this this growth curve. We've been around, again, 25 years. We had really no security to speak of about 10 years ago. Had to hire a CSO, so that was in 2012. Back then, and I started in 2013, so when I joined, there was like 6 or 8 people, and everything was outsourced. It was not going well. We didn't know what was happening, what we were doing, and pretty immature across the board. In 2015, we began migrating to AWS. I'll say our migration was random people doing whatever they want, and that was basically what was happening. Shadow IT, corporate cards, building accounts using their personal email addresses, right, and then deploying production. I mean, no segregation of nothing, right? I see a couple head nods. Everyone's like, yep. So yeah, going back to the second point, we had no central management, and central management can be hardening, it can be visibility, cost optimization, whatever you want it to be. No cloud security. I don't really know what cloud security means. It means something different to everybody, but we weren't doing anything, right? Whether it be vuln scanning, response, best practices, governance, nothing. One interesting thing we did was adopt the NIST CSF. And the reason for that, if anybody remembers when that was pushed out, we had to figure out, like, where should we even prioritize? What direction are we going? And so what we did was we took that and mapped it against our environment, and then, you know, kind of tried to kind of understand the controls that were applicable to us and how to prioritize working through those. Flash forward to 2020. Roughly 100, 110 folks in our security organization. That includes, of course, like we have a small IAM team, AppSec, BCP, DR, so forth and so on, physical security. Specific to kind of what we're talking about here, our SIM and SOAR team sits within my organization as well. We were bringing in about 3 terabytes a day of log data, which, again, every company is different. I don't know if that's a lot or not. It just really depends. But we also implemented that very bottom point, which was critical. So if anybody's familiar with AWS organizations, it's a pretty solid way to build policies, whether it be in our space as security practitioners or just other, you know, governance type controls. And what that allowed us to do, and we'll get there kind of specific to detective and how it's benefited us, is give us that full visibility and transparency across all of our 170, 180 accounts, which, again, subjective based on, you know, kind of how you have your organization configured. But going back to one of the first things, it helped alleviate the I don't have the data I need when I need it, right, in the line of fire problem. Present state, mentioned 170 or so accounts. That's probably gone up by the time I started talking. We're bringing in about 15 terabytes of log data a day. We've got a pretty cool like log gap matrix that we've built based on relevance and urgency to the security organization. That third bullet is really important. Our alert volume has doubled roughly in the last year and a half. A lot of reasons for that in more of the behavioral space. When COVID started, right, what was normal, what even is normal, was totally abnormal, right? Your whole workforce was in an office, your whole workforce was at home, private, or people were using their, you know, ISPs for authentication, all that jazz, right? So that's definitely, you know, one big reason. More tools in the environment, whether it be through AWS or otherwise, or we've just written really good detections too, right? I mean, there could be a variety of reasons. Nonetheless, that will parlay into one of the big pain points that every SOC on Earth, I'm going to assume, faces. And then the future. Next year, I think we'll run at least 20 terabytes of data. If I can convince my CSO to spend a boatload more on our log aggregation and SIM platform, it'll hopefully be more than that. Our security team is continuing to grow. We're building out new functions in a couple different disciplines. And then ZTNA, like classic top of mind buzzword everyone's talking about. But it's a journey that we started last year and probably a 3 to 5 year thing. Again, it's going to look different for everybody, but it's really relevant to detective and how that's helped us. So that's kind of where we're going. Okay, so lack of visibility. Going back to I need to convince my CSO to bring in, or to allow us to bring in a bunch more data. We're not ingesting right now VPC flow logs in their raw nature. A couple reasons. We've looked at it. We would run roughly 3 to 4 terabytes a day, right, of flow logs. It's also really hard to discern immediate value from a single flow log. If you think about like this one transaction and that one transaction, if they're part of a bigger session, how do you stitch that together? There are ways, but that's definitely a pain point for us as far as trying to see everything in our log aggregation platform. The lack of correlation for related security events. If you've ever been in an event and you get the alert of alerts and you have to respond to that alert, what's not to say that there wasn't alerts prior to that, right? Or activity that occurred prior to that maybe you don't have a detection for. Port scanning is really hard to identify internally as a great example. Guard duty, which then sends to detective, does a really good job of that, especially if it's coming from a source right on your network. And so getting that correlation through, as Rima demonstrated in her demo, just really speeds up that time to response for us. And every minute in our field can literally be make or break. The third one is super interesting. We use a lot of serverless architecture, auto-scaling groups. I'm not going to pretend like I know how all the devs, I don't even know what a dev is nowadays, honestly. But I'm not going to pretend like I know exactly how they do that. What I do know is we've had events in the past and we've received some kind of visibility into anomalous behavior. Well, if you think about an EC2 auto-scaling group and say that host only lives for an hour a day, 2 hours a day, whatever the case may be, if you're reliant on endpoint-based controls to be deployed, whether it be through AWS or something else, how do you know that they're even there, right? If you're reliant on your ITAM database to be your source of truth, an ephemeral piece of infrastructure may not be there. So stitching things like that together has been really, really critical for us in detective. It's super hard to do manually unless you know exactly what you're looking for. And I know our team doesn't have time to go survey 1,000 developer DevOps people and say, tell us all your ephemeral infrastructure. It's just not how it's going to work. So that's been a really big one. So how's this helped? As alluded to before, VPC flow logs automatically ingested, right? Not just ingested for us, but visualized as well. And so we can then begin to look at source dest. Okay, dest then becomes source in a lateral movement type scenario. So that's been critical. The second one, again, correlating common metadata. And so that can be either based on your VPC flow logs, right? So common pivot points or something else. And then the third one is huge. There used to be 90 days of retention, and there is a year, which we do have our security log retention for 365 days because reasons, security. I mean, yeah, it's great. We have had to go back. Compliance, not that I care a ton about compliance, but yeah, there are reasons for that. And so having that capability built into detective has been really significant for us. Not enough people. So sometimes this can be misconstrued as alert fatigue, right? And that to me is a totally separate problem. Rich kind of mentioned the NIST study earlier. I've read a couple different things over the years around your security to developer ratio, at least in the InfoSec practitioner space. I've read 10 to 1 developer to security individual. I've read 15 to 1. We're in that boat. 5+ is a very low estimate. Again, define a developer nowadays. I think that's a challenge in itself. But if you think about how that works in the context of, what we're trying to do as a SOC, we've only got so many people. Human labor is the most expensive resource at a company, period. The odds of me improving our efficiency within our SOC are much greater than getting 10 headcount approved. That's just how things work. a lot of practitioners that, whether I've interviewed over the years or just talked to, don't have practical hands-on experience in responding to these types of events in AWS. I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert by any means, but it's really hard to get experience without getting experience. We also have this fundamental mindset, this goal. I don't want our analysts and engineers responding to an event of pick a type for the first time in production, right? I would love for them to be able to have seen that in practice in a controlled environment before the real thing happens. And then the third one is a huge one, right? We try and map our process back to Pickerel, if anybody's, or Picerel, depending on how you pronounce it. That after action item lessons learned process is absolutely critical in our world. The reality, though, is if you want to get to that point and you want to dig deep, Rich mentioned kind of another customer testimonial, you may not get there. More stuff happens. As I've tried to explain to my mom for a decade about what I do for a living, I'm like, yeah, people, threat actors don't just take Christmas off. That's just not how it works, right? We get alerts 24/7, 365. I should have mentioned this earlier, but half our team is in Manila, right? So we do a follow the sun model for those reasons. And it's just hard to keep up. In a perfect world, we would take every alert. We would do whatever we need to based on, runbooks, processes, and all that. And then we drive a lot of change, but we would drive even more. And so anything that we can do to speed that up is critical for us. Okay, I'm going to go kind of quick here. So how has this helped, right? Automating tasks, so that can be tied to ingestion of logs that you may not have readily available. Alerts, I mentioned how we've deployed our controls, not just detective, guard duty, WAF, and some others at the organization level. They can't be modified or tampered by anybody underneath that kind of God right. Low learning curve. Rima showed the demo. It's pretty point and click. I'm middle management guy and I can do it. So I promise anybody else can too. And then the third one's really interesting. When we respond to a guard duty event, we'll go into detective, and it's really, really helpful in discerning the affected asset or assets and then correlating that to what you should go be digging into, whether it be in the UI or in your CloudTrail logs. I put ARNs down as an example. Another really tough use case is I have an issue with an EC2. It's kind of tough at times to see if that's behind the load balancer or some other service such as an API gateway at first glance. So it's really, really helpful, especially with the finding groups. I mean, you can see how everything is tied together. And then prioritize findings, right? The reality is we can't respond to every alert, nor do I think we want to respond to every alert. We may have a tuning opportunity or a suppression opportunity, just depending on our, our control stack. Getting the right things in front of the right people. Everyone has a different definition of what's critical to their business. The crown jewel idea, that could be PII, that could be customer data of some other type. It could be IP. It really doesn't matter. But we want to get correlated findings of high quality, but also serious risk to our business based on what we've defined in front of our analysts as quickly as possible. And that's where the finding groups really, really play a key part. If I got one event for a port scan, my level of confidence is going to be raised if I see in potential risk if there's 12 other events tied to it. And then the third one too, I don't know what normal is. It changes every day. But I do know that guard duty, specifically in VPC flow, feeding into detective, can help us really speed up that process in detecting that anomalous behavior. Easy to understand visualizations, right? We walk through that. The search capability that Rich mentioned, so you can kind of use it as a little search engine within the console. Super helpful, can minimize time versus scouring in your aggregation platform. And then baselining your VPC flow log volume. Sudden spikes, sudden decreases, massive duration times or session times or session connections that you wouldn't expect across regions or whatever is really, really valuable. I appreciate it. If you thought that was okay, I Thank you. If you thought it sucked, you can blame Rich. And yeah, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here. We're all on the same team, right? We're all at this conference for a reason as security practitioners. Unless you're a threat actor and you're here, very strange decision, but I guess welcome nonetheless. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jordan. Like I said, I just love hearing customer conversations. I've also really piqued my interest on a couple of things we could do better. So thanks again for joining us. Here are a couple of builders sessions that we have. So if you're interested and like to get a little bit more hands-on, you can go ahead and do that. And then we do ask you that you'll leave the headsets here because they'll go ahead and clean them. And also please fill out the survey. We're always eager to hear feedback and see what we can do better. Thanks again.